ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Foscari. My name is Vera Constantini, and I'm very glad this morning to meet you and to welcome you here. Seeing such a distinguished and numerous audience today joining us out of interest for the history of Venice and the Ottoman Levant fills my heart with joy. It is an honor for this university to host the first Levantine Heritage Foundation meeting in Venice, and I'm grateful to Quentin, Compton-Bishop, Craig Answer, Philip Mansel, and Luis Miguel Cervelli for having trusted me as the local partner of such a prestigious and renowned institution. Approaches to the Ottoman heritage vary, sometimes considerably, from country to country, from university to university, if not from scholar to scholar. In this meeting, I am glad to share with you our particular perspective, that of using Mamluk and Ottoman sources for a different understanding of the history of Venice. Those among you who are fond of Venetian studies might be surprised by the benefits of a comparative approach that can only emerge from the analysis of a broad spectrum of primary sources. Among the available sources, those produced by the Ottoman authorities at all levels occupy a special place, since the relationship with the Ottoman Empire has been for centuries the cornerstone of the Republic of St. Mark's foreign policy. Even the relations with other countries varied according to the priorities set by Venice's eastward vocation. I would like to extend my warmest thanks to Quentin, Craig, Philip, and Miguel for their sincere curiosity in this approach and open-mindedness in accepting to dedicate part of this meeting to talks that will illustrate this approach. Your curiosity and open-mindedness are rare merchandise. They are now in good hands and will be treasured for years to come. I would also like to thank the director of the Department of Asian and North African Studies at Foscari, Professor Marco Ceresa, for his support during the department's council when I first presented the project for this meeting. Last but not least, I would like to thank the Association of Italian-Turkish Friendship for its support in organizing tomorrow's guided tour, and in particular for the irreplaceable help of the interns, Mrs. Ade Milani, Chiara Marchesi, Chiara Pernigotto Cego, and Martina Tiozzo Brasiola. Wishing you all an inspiring session of work, I have the honor to give the floor to the chairman of the Levantine Heritage Foundation, Mr. Quentin Compton-Bishop. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much, Vera, for that very kind introduction. So I'm only going to take a few minutes of time just to talk about the Levantine Heritage Foundation, sort of why we exist and what we do. As you can see from our mission statement, we aim to advance research, education and preservation of the heritage, arts and cultures of the communities of the Levant region. So it is quite a broad interest that we have. Just to give you a little bit of background about how we got started. The essence of it is built around a core, a network of researchers, family researchers, that combination of academics and independent researchers who have an interest in Ottoman Levantine studies. It's a very broad view, and it always throws up the question, who are the Levantines? Now, the Levantine Heritage Foundation takes a very broad, inclusive approach. It's more to do with what are the common characteristics, traits, interactions but different communities with quite different origins, faiths, backgrounds have, because they coexisted and interacted in the old Ottoman Empire. You may find some who define Levantines as a very narrow group, those that lived in the big houses, the Europeans. But that for us is not sufficient because it does not explain the context and the detail of what actually happened and the legacy that they left us today. So we cover economic, social, cultural history, anything that concerns the interactions of that community. It started, thanks to Craig Enser back way before 2010 when the foundation itself was set up, by his building a website where a lot of these memories, testimonials, images, lists of publications were assembled. And that's how I found Craig, because I was researching my own Levantine history. And in 2010 in Izmir, there was a conference sponsored by the Izmir Chamber of Commerce and organised by George Galdiz and the late Alex Baltazzi, himself of, I think, Venetian origin, which really sparked the model. This combination, very fertile combination of academics and independent family researchers. The one providing detailed context from their research about Ottoman history, the Levantines. The others seeking to identify and understand how their family fitted into that context. And the families very often have interesting and important archives, sources of research material for the academics. And the Levantine Heritage Foundation almost acts like a broker. It builds a network, introduces people to each other, so academics can talk to independent researchers and vice versa. The website is now the leading authority, I would say, on things Levantine in terms of the collection. We get countless requests each year from people asking for information about family, can we use an image, things like that. And we, largely through Craig, try and help people as much as we can. It's a free resource. That's why it's our effort to educate people about how there are more things in common between some of these communities than actually the differences would suggest. So on our website you'll see events, and we operate largely through events like these, online, live, testimonials, so personal records of family histories, recordings of events, image databases, lists of publications, and our latest interest is in family archives. One of the great challenges that the whole field of Ottoman studies has from a family perspective is that so much is lost with each generation. The next generation don't necessarily understand the value of some of the material to researchers that come after. So we are very keen in our next phase of growth to secure family archives, preserve them for future generations, digitize them, and make them accessible in the same way that all material on our website is freely accessible. My appeal to you is, if you think you can help, if you are interested, if you can support us in any of these things, then please do. It's customary that at each event I introduce the next event. So just to highlight that we try and have an online event once a month. So we have one on the 13th of December, Enlightening Europe on Islam and the Ottomans by Professor Carter Finley. It's all about the Swedish diplomat of Armenian origin, and his great tome on the law and the state of the Ottoman Empire. It's a joint event with the Anglo-Turkish Society. Most of our events start at 6 o'clock UK time. If you can join, please do register. We have a number of events that are coming up. We're just finalising dates. But it shows the diversity of what we cover. So the Levant company, we have Michael Wagner, I think it's in January. Ben Singer, he's done a really comprehensive study about his family origins, and I believe he is of Ashkenazi, not Sephardi origins. I think so. That is unique again for us the first time. There is the possibility of having another in-person event in Istanbul, following meetings that Craig had with the Istanbul municipality at the Metroban, in partnership with the independent Levantine Association, LKMD, who operate out of Istanbul. And then we have another talk following in the spring from Uri Schmidt on the Rosdi-backed department store chain. So this is a Hungarian family that built a chain of department stores across the Levant in Cairo and elsewhere. Do register, everything's on the website, and I would encourage you to have a look, and if you feel you can support us, then please do. We've got details on the leaflets, and you can also sign up, or you can talk to me and I'll help you. So lastly, just thank you everybody, thank you Vera. You've already expressed your thanks, let me thank you. Thank the speakers for giving up their time, really appreciate you coming today. And the sponsors and friends whose funding has supported this event. Miguel Cervelli for introducing us to Vera, very important, and to Carl Posteli. Vera, what can I say? You've done so much for us. Thank you so much. Really, it's so important to have a local partner and who's providing this venue through your good offices. The Italian-Turkish Friendship Association in Venice, you've already mentioned, but thank you to them. Of course, Yaki Minache, who hosted speakers dinner last night, thank you. And last but certainly not least, to our interns, Martina Tiotto-Bozio, and thank you all for coming today. So I'm now going to introduce Philip and we'll get on with the programme properly. So Philip Mansel is one of the founding members of the Levantine Heritage Foundation, an historian of France and the Middle East, with a real focus on the Levant. He has written a number of books, including Constantini, City of the World's Desire, Paris Between Empires, and Levant, Splendor, the Catastrophe on the Mediterranean, the first history in English of Smyrna, Alexandria, and Beirut since 1600. One of its themes is how Muslims, Christians, and Jews have lived together in cities. The city is very much a focus of his research. He's lived in Paris, Istanbul, and Beirut. His most recent books are Aleppo, The Rise and Fall of Syria's Great Merchant City, and most recently, King of the World, The Life of Louis XIV, and these books have been translated into Italian, German, French, so they are available. And for more information about Philip's background and his publications, please do go to his website, philipmansel.com. So without further ado, Philip, can I pass the microphone to you? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Quentin. Thank you, Vera, for this incredible occasion. And the view from Ca' Foscari I can only compare to the view from the Palazzo di Venezia in Istanbul, where you have the great view of the mosques of Istanbul, and which is on the site of the old by those residents since the 16th century. And I would like to repeat what Vera said about the Ottoman relationship being the cornerstone of the Republic. Well, for Louis XIV, about whom I've just written, no relationship was more important than the French-Ottoman relationship also. And there's this wonderful facade of hypocrisy. I only think of the Catholic Church, etc., etc., etc. But in fact, he's encouraging the Ottoman Empire to attack his enemy in Europe, which is Austria. So he's encouraging them. I don't think he would have been very sad if Vienna had fallen to the Ottomans. All countries of Europe had an important Ottoman relationship, not quite all, but an awful lot, like, for example, Poland, which depended later on its survival on Ottoman support. And I think it is now beginning. The whole history of Europe should be rethought through the Ottoman Empire, the role of Ottoman trade in Marseille and in other cities was, and in Trieste, and of course in Venice, was really vital. And I want to just give a general overview for the more detailed talks later on the Venetian-Ottoman relationship. Here you see a map of the two states around 1500. You see the great Venetian Empire, which you don't really feel in modern Italian Venice. But here is this really great power owning Cyprus, Crete, many of the Aegean islands, and the whole Dalmatian coast. Well able to hold its own against the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire then as much European as Asian before it conquered Syria and Egypt in 1516. And there were, of course, many wars. 1463 to 79, 1499 to 1503, 1537 to 1540, 1570 to 1573, when there's the great victory of Lepanto, of the Holy League of Spain, Venice, and the papacy against the Ottoman Empire. And then 1645 to 69, the longest of all, the War of Crete, where Venice was defeated and Venice lost Crete to what was still the rising power of the Ottoman Empire. And then more wars, 1683 to 1699, when Venice for a time governed the Peloponnese. And 1715 to 19, the last Ottoman-Venetian War. But most of the time, the two countries were at peace. And most of the time, there was trade, an immense amount of trade in a huge variety of objects. Cheese, clocks, watches, among many other things. And of course, the slave trade, whose whole history hasn't really been fully written, how slaves were a very prized product in the Mediterranean, and Christians would have Christian slaves, and even some Muslims would have Muslim slaves. So religion wasn't all important. Trade came first, as many people always complained about Venice being the courtesan of the Turks. And also cultural contacts. This very, very famous, great portrait by Gentile Bellini of the conqueror, Fatih, Mehmed II, the man who took Constantinople for the Ottoman Empire. And you see three crowns. No one's quite sure what they represent, probably Europe, Asia, and southern Italy, or maybe Trabzon. And you see how this Ottoman Sultan is framed in an Italian Renaissance frame. So it's a visual representation of the links between East and West, of which many buildings in Venice are also visual representations of those links. And when peace was made in 1479, he had asked the Venetian government to send him a good painter. So Bellini was sent, and he was for a time a member of his household. So a Venetian is a member of the Sultan's household, and Not enough is known about the 2 or 3 years he spent in Istanbul, but there were other paintings, like this one, which probably shows Fatih and his son, which was recently sold on the London art market. So maybe there's more to come. And by the way, this picture, no one knows its history really after Fatih's reign, but somehow it reached Venice and was bought by Sir Henry Layard, the great British archaeologist, ambassador in Istanbul in the 1880s, friend of Abdul Hamid and later of great Venetian who lived in Venice and had a collection, and he bought this picture and then he gave it to the National Gallery, and it is now on loan to the Victorian Albert Museum, where it is surrounded by wonderful Ottoman artifacts. So the story of a picture showing these varied cultural and commercial links. And how were these links possible? Because there was this extraordinary interzone, Vera or Beirut or whatever you want to call it, on the hills above the Golden Horn, where embassies and merchants lived. And in fact, the British Library contains the original document which permitted mainly Genoese Christians to go on living there and trading there after 1453. And many families stayed in, like the De Testa family, stayed in Istanbul from before 1453 until the 20th century. Always interpreters, negotiators, merchants, diplomats, often acquiring finally Dutch or French or Italian nationality. So some of our conferences have been attended by members of the De Testa family. And this interaction between, and of course the other interzone was Venice itself. There were always Ottoman merchants of varied religions in Venice since the 15th century or probably earlier. And here's another picture by Bellini of a scribe, now in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. And please note the incredible fabric he's wearing. Fabrics and textiles are another vital element in the trade between Venice and the Ottoman Empire, and indeed, I believe some fabrics, the patterns were so similar, it's not certain whether some fabrics are Ottoman or Venetian. They're using the same patterns and indeed the same velvet or silk. And here's another picture showing the interaction in Damascus. This shows some Venetian diplomats before the Mameluke governor in Damascus about 1510, just before the Ottoman conquest, which changed the whole history of Syria and Egypt. And they are apologizing to the Mamelukes for having attempted to make a secret treaty with Persia behind the Mamelukes' gap at the moment where there's a three-sided struggle for control of the Middle East between the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and the Mameluke Sultans of Egypt. So you see the black-robed Venetian diplomats. The Venetians were everywhere in the eastern Mediterranean. And here is another symbol of this interaction, the fascinating figure of Alvisi Gritti. The some families were constantly in the Middle East. They were called di Levante, the British. They had even been in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem before 1291. And Alvisi Gritti, he's illegitimate. It was said of him that he lived as a Turk among Turks and as a Christian among Christians. He becomes a jewel merchant in Beirut. He's the son of a Venetian bailo. They give very grand banquets 1300 and 1524, and he later becomes an Ottoman agent involved in the Ottoman conquest of Hungary in the 1520s, and he's later is executed. But he had not before he'd been involved in the commissioning in Venice of a crown for Suleiman the Magnificent himself, Kanuni Suleiman, a 4-layer crown. Why 4 layers? Because the Pope had 3 layers, so the Ottoman Sultan had to be better and grander, and this is part of an aspect of the Ottoman Empire competing with other European monarchs. He's competing with the Emperor Charles V, who had just been crowned in Bologna by the Pope, Emperor of the West, so he has, encouraged by his Greek origin, Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, he has to show actually he's a better and grander emperor. And nobody knows, I believe, what happened to this crown. It must have been broken up in Istanbul and the jewels redistributed. But you see a Venetian print showing the crown, confirming again that Venice was as much trading with as fighting the Ottoman Empire. And here's a map, a Venetian map of the Mediterranean, again cartography. What Venice was at the forefront of European cartography, and some of these Venetian maps would be asked for by Ottomans because they wanted the sons of Suleiman the Magnificent, as they're competing to be the next Sultan. They wanted Venetian maps as the best guide to their ambitions. And many, many travel books being printed and written in Venice about the Ottoman Empire. This is by Giuseppe Rosaccio. This is a Venetian view of Cairo. Again, they had been merchants in Alexandria and Egypt since the 13th century, or probably before. And this is the Palazzo Dario on the right, where Ottoman envoys were housed in Venice. And there were many Ottoman envoys, not permanent, but living in Venice. And Venetian bylaw, as Vera well knows, the amount of information they're sending from Istanbul to Venice about news, trade, what's happening, make the reports a huge resource for historians. And any aspect of Ottoman history, often noticing things that official Ottoman documents don't notice. And the bylaw, the Venetian representative in Vera, he is a diplomat, he is a judge because he has his own law courts, and he has to have banquets, so he's a host, he's really a hotelier for visiting Venetians, and even students' rooms in the palace for students of Ottoman. And sometimes the Bailey would have, there's a book, a wonderful book by Eric Durstler about this, would have Ottoman friends. I quote from a letter the Grand Vizier Halil Pasha writes to a later bailiff, Simone Contarini, after his return to Venice in 1612. The love and affection of our heart towards you has never ever wavered or moved apart. And lots of descriptions of parties in the Venetian palace in Istanbul. There's also a sex trade, and there's an Italian proverb, che vuol fare sua rovina prende moglie levantina. If you want to ruin your life, you take a Levantine wife. And so on. And indeed, So close were the links that sometimes the Venetian bailo would celebrate an Ottoman victory over a Christian power, for example, over Hungary in 1526. And this is the Fondaco dei Turchi on the Grand Canal, which was for merchants from the Ottoman Empire with a prayer room inside, I think. And this was unique in Christian Europe, a place especially for Ottoman merchants, who on the whole were very badly treated in Marseille and French ports, but not in Venice. And to show you the trade between the two cities, this is some Lorenzo Lotto portraits showing these carpets. Often the carpets in Venetian portraits are the best source for historians of carpets and textiles. There's no other record, as you can see. So sometimes early Turkish carpets are called Lotto carpets. Here it is again. You see the place of honor in a picture. And again, a family having in the home, a prosperous family would have, if possible, a Turkish carpet. And this is what is now the Italian embassy in Istanbul, but the Italian consulate is on the site of the former Palazzo di Venezia of the Baili di Venezia. And here is a representation of the bailo with two Turkish officials supporting him, so frightened that the Sultan might be assassinated, because one Sultan might be assassinated, that you always had to have two on either side to make sure you weren't going to do this. And the very distinctive hat of the bailo, I wonder what the history of that hat is, and where it came from. You'll be seeing it later in other pictures. And here is a famous portrait of Barbaro, Antonio Barbaro, the bailo at the time of the Lepanto War. And there's a war, there's a world war, the two states are fighting to death, but the bailo is put under safeguard in Mark Antonio Barbaro, in Istanbul, in the tower that is still there. And this picture is celebrating his years as bailo and is dedicated, and I quote, to the Lord Mehmed Pasha, vizier of the Muslims, the best friend, optimo amico, from Mark Antonio Barbaro. And it's possible that the Church of the Salute, built later, partly inspired by him, is the dome with the two towers. It has a curious resemblance to an Ottoman mosque. Deborah Howard has written about this, and the architectural influence of the Ottoman Empire and Egypt on Venice. And they maintained communication through the war via a Jewish doctor called Solomon Ashkenazi, who later helped draft the peace treaty between the two states. So there were always intermediaries going on, even when there's a war on. But the post of bailo was, and I quote, above all others, full of inextricable difficulties, wrote one Venetian ambassador. And this is from a book of illustrations in the Museum of Korea here in Venice, and it shows the life of a bailo in the 17th century. He would have 50 to 100 people in his household, many of whom would be trading. And this shows a trading in Istanbul. You see the things are being weighed. This shows, I think, a horse market. Now this is the horse market. And this is rather less fortunate, where a bailo is being escorted by Turkish officials to prison because there's a war on in the mid-17th century. But Ballerino being led to prison. Now he is again. And this is a dragoman being murdered in 1640 because there's a war. And so there's always the fear. But on the whole, many Venetians were fascinated by the Ottoman Empire and wanted to go there. And I quote from an account of 1582 when an ambassador called Jacopo Soranzo writes, "An infinite number of gentlemen scrambled with warm requests to be admitted to the number of those that, considering the noble and rare occasion to see the port, that is the Ottoman government, the security and comfort of the voyage." Imagine that, 1582, it's secure and comfortable. The information that one could acquire among many things, and to serve Venice, they all apply to join the escort of the Venetian ambassador. And here you see another dragoman of the Tarsia family from Dalmatia. Dalmatia is another interface between the two countries, and they supplied many dragomans to Venice. Jacopo Tarsia and his sons and brothers would also be dragomans. I quote, "The Tarsia family have been comforted in the last 6 months by the many favours which they certainly deserve that they received from the Venetian government." And they were very skilled. And two sons of this gentleman, Cristoforo Tarsia, would become dragomans in the term. And among the many pictures drawn of Istanbul, and I hope one day there will be an exhibition of these incredible pictures and the artifacts brought back. Here is a panorama of Istanbul, and that is a panorama of Beyoğlu, the other side of the Golden Wall, with the tower, which many of you will know, on top of the hill. And here is an incredible panorama done in 1741 from the Palazzo di Venezia in Beyoğlu, of the point of the Palace Saraybolu and the Bosphorus of the Golden Wall. The number of ships always in Istanbul, because it was a great trading port as well as a political and cultural capital. And one aspect of the life of Milo was giving presents, always presents, to Ottoman officials, money at the time of Bayram, Büyük Bayram, or Küçük Bayram, money even to imperial gatekeepers or the guardian of the lions, or the drummers, or the doorkeepers of the imperial arsenal. And then many Ottomans would also give very detailed requests for presents, like cheese, or ivory knives, watches and clocks above all, and combs for lice, and beard combs would also be supplied by Venetian officials to the Ottoman friends. And the Grand Vizier's interpreter's mother would request glasses, cups, glass bottles, and so on. And Venetian medicines were also very welcome. This is all through the 17th century and 18th century. And even the head of the eunuchs would ask for glass window panes for the palace from Venice. So Venice as a source of luxuries and necessities, which was also used in everyday diplomacy. Istanbul, which was started about 10 years ago. These are by the great embassy artist Jean-Baptiste Van Moor, who worked for the French, Dutch and Venetian ambassador. And these show probably one of the Gritti family, the ceremonial entry of an ambassador into Istanbul, which would show to the people of Istanbul and the officials of the empire the power of their state. So you see, it's not just the ambassador on horseback. Again, this is unusual because normally Christians were not allowed to, in theory, to ride horses. And you see how many gentlemen are following him because they would join an embassy as an excuse and reason to visit the Ottoman Empire. There you see it again. This is a series of 4 pictures. And here he is entering the courtyard of Topkapi Palace. And in front of him there are 2 interpreters, one for the Ottoman government and one for the Venetian government, supplied by these Italian, Venetian and Genoese families living in Beirut or Vera. And in the background there are janissaries reaching for the food, the rations of rice. This was arranged to coincide with the arrival of an ambassador, so the ambassador was in theory impressed by the power and discipline of the Ottoman army. All theatre of power and diplomacy, a ceremony with a definite message, and the descriptions are unbelievably detailed, always recording how many honours were paid by the Ottoman government to a particular ambassador, and inevitably the ambassador will report back to his government, "Oh, I received more honours than any previous ambassador," but I think you have to take it with a pinch of salt. And they were given robes of honour, kaftans, which were then sold back to dealers, who then sold back the robes of honour to the Ottoman government, and then they were recycled to go to other diplomats. And here you see he's being breakfasted, it's always early in the morning, by the Grand Vizier in the Divan Hane, which you can visit now today in Topkapi Palace. The room has changed remarkably little since this picture was painted in about 1725. And so you see a Christian diplomat is being entertained to a meal by the Grand Vizier, the ruler under the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, with judges on the right and other Ottoman officials on the left, and the 2 interpreters on either side. These Van Moor pictures have been seen in Istanbul. There's never been a proper, and in Amsterdam, where most of them are, there's never been a proper exhibition in London or Paris. Again, that's hopefully will happen one day. And here is the supreme moment where he is being presented to the Sultan himself in the throne room of Topkapi Palace. Again, you can see the throne room today. The Sultan is so grand, he's looking straight ahead, not at the ambassador. In other embassies, he would be politely chatting to the ambassador, but not in the Ottoman Empire. At most, he says, at the beginning, in say 1500, he would talk to the ambassador. As they become grander and more powerful, he stops talking, or he says, "Peki, it is well." And this picture shows the ambassador proudly standing, but other accounts suggest actually he's bowing in front of the Sultan, maybe even in theory touching the ground. But people say so many different accounts, but at least once a French ambassador was forced to the ground in front of the Sultan. It's a really important moment it's the peak of an ambassador's career. So of course he will commission pictures of it. There he is talking to the most powerful ruler in Europe. And strangely enough, there are no pictures equivalent for or very few for the reception of an ambassador by a king of France or a king of England or a Russian emperor. So it's extremely useful for the history of diplomacy and ceremonial, as well as for the history of Ottoman-Venetian relations. Again, showing how important Ottoman history is as a general European source. And I'm just going to show you some pictures of the titles of some of the Venetian books about the Ottoman Empire. Venice as a source of information, as a place of news exchange. You see lives of the emperors of the Turks, Pietro Bertelli, Battista, by History of the Present State of the Ottoman Empire by Constantini. That is 1672, printed in Venice. Historical memoirs on the Ottoman monarchs by Giovanni Sagredo. That is 1679, a sort of growth of books and information about Venice towards the end of the 17th century, as Venetian ambitions are reviving in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not just a history of decline, that's a fantasy that often more aggressive around the 1990s. The Voyage to Constantinople of Giovanni Battista Donato, Venetian senator and bailo to the Sublime Porte in 1680, dedicated to the ruler of Tuscany. That's published in 1688, and the first Western book on Turkish literature was written by Donato, again published in Venice in 1688, who was later bailo in Constantinople. And here is a portrait of Donato. And then one of the last books on Turkish literature by Giambattista Toderini, done in Venice in 1787. There's a sort of revival of interest and trade in the late 18th century, and other scientists and doctors and plant hunters go with the Venetian ambassador to Istanbul in the 1780s. And of course, one famous Venetian traveller and describer of Istanbul is Casanova himself. He goes with a bailo to Istanbul in 1745. Many nobles going to Constantinople for their own amusement. That's what he writes in his memoirs. A more magnificent panorama cannot be found in the whole world, and he calls Istanbul the proper seat of the empire of the whole world. He meets many renegades or converts to Islam in Istanbul, but he has long conversations about the nature of God. He claimed that Ismail Effendi attempted liberties which were not at all to my taste or my person. And then he does complain, though, in Istanbul, it's a country where weariness of life was more deadly to foreigners than the plague. Anyway, these descriptions, yes, he goes in 1786, in the splendid court of His Excellency Agostino Gazzoni, Venetian bailo to the Sublime Porte. So the household was so grand and so large it's compared to a royal court. And these dispatches, the bylaws as a source of information, it goes on even after the fall of the Republic. 55 dispatches written by Francesco Vendramin, the last Venetian bylaw between 1796 and 97. He goes on sending them even when France has conquered the Venetian Republic. And the Ottoman government continued for a time to regard him as an ambassador, not knowing how to act otherwise. And what you notice in the whole history of Venetian Ottoman relations, the same names are often coming up: Britti, Montenegro, Nani, Dona, and Memo, and Bembo. And when Greeks are beginning to think of Greek independence and liberty in the 1790s, the ecumenical patriarch, the head of the nation, warns them against following the fashion of the French Revolution because of the fall of Venice and the French Republican armies. Where is now the inexhaustible treasury of the very ancient and serene Republic of the Venetians? And he calls the French Republic this illusory system of the diabolical one, partly because of the fall of Venice. It was thought to be so shocking to Ottomans, whether Greek or Muslim. And there's no time to talk about the other great centers of Venice in Smyrna and Alexandria. This is a painting by Tonioli, a Venetian, of Sultan Abdulhamid in the 1780s. Just to say, there were Venetians in Smyrna, as we will hear later. This is a description of the islands of the archipelago done by Francesco Lupazzolo, who was living in Chios and later becomes a legendary Venetian consul in Smyrna, who is said to have lived to 100 and to have had many, many children, 100 children. There is Izmir in about 1730. And here, now let's go to Aleppo, just briefly, a great center of Venetian trade since the 13th century. And again, often the same families, like the Malipiero family of Venice, supplied 11 consuls in the 16th century. It's a huge center of trade from the 1550s, when the Venetian consulate moved from Tripoli on the coast to Aleppo. There are about 40 Venetian firms in 1500 dealing in cloth, silk, spices. It's a center for the trade coming from Persia and India to Aleppo and then being bought by Venetians or French. Just to show you how Venice is at the heart of so much that's happening in the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East. In 1531, a wealthy Venetian merchant called Andrea Morosini was killed in Aleppo because he'd been sheltering agents disguised as merchants sent by the Emperor Charles V to contact the Shah of Iran to try to organize a joint Iranian-Habsburg attack on the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans found out about it and killed him. Aleppo was, and I quote, where the merchants live and business is done. And this is the map of the travels of Antonio Bembo, nephew of the Venetian consul in Aleppo, to India in about 1680. You see a regular route through Iran to India. Venetians were great travelers, and he had with him a French artist called Grelot. And here you see a very early view of the city of Aleppo, done for this Venetian traveller of the family of Bembo, who had many members in trade and diplomacy in the Ottoman Empire. And here you see the state entry of a Venetian consul into Aleppo in 1680. See, it's an Ottoman ceremony with janissaries and troops and many spectators watching it, as the entry of the Bailo was into Istanbul. It's to show Ottoman protection for foreign diplomats. And that is a photograph in Aleppo of the former Venetian consulate, Khan al-Bandika, it was called. 1615, the trade in Aleppo is as flourishing as ever with the Venetian consul. There still come caravans from different places with valuable goods, especially silk. And afterwards it is replaced by Smyrna, really. And Bembo describes his life there in the 1680s. Taverns were run by English and French, lots of dinners, lots of parties. It all seems quite peaceful. But 1675, the consulate was closed until 1762. Then trade revives. And here is a rather wonderful book published after the fall of the Republic. And I think this is the best picture I could get. 1799 in Venice. It's a relation of the trade of Aleppo. So the Republic has disappeared, but the trade goes on, or the memory of trade continues. And this was a wonderful place which Vera knows, the Koche house in Aleppo, which was said to be the former Venetian consulate, which was full of treasures about this international trade in Aleppo, owned by Jenny Marash. You see the treasures at the top, a really wonderful collection of objects, antiquities, violin case, and so on, and then below its condition in 2017 as a result of the Syrian civil war. And I'd like to end with and this Venetian life goes on in Aleppo, in Smyrna, and in Istanbul until the 20th century. People are still emigrating from Italy to the Ottoman Empire because that's the Marcopoli family of Aleppo, leading merchants and consuls who claimed Venetian descent. Because after the fall of Venice, it was the smart thing to say, oh, my family were Venetians. And the last representative of the many Venetian painters in the Ottoman Empire is an artist from Masi di Padova, but he often called himself Pittore Veneto, is the extraordinary figure of Fausto Zonaro, who comes from the Veneto to Istanbul in 1891, and then he becomes a favorite artist of foreign diplomats, and he paints this picture of a crack regiment of the Ottoman army, the Ertugrul cavalry, crossing the Galata Bridge, and it's presented to the Sultan. It's a way of winning the Sultan's favor. And in 1896, this gentleman from near Venice becomes official peintre de Sa Majesté Impériale le Sultan, painter of His Majesty the Sultan. And we have the great good fortune that Zonaro not only paints the city, but also wrote his memoirs, and his wife took photographs. So we have a treble account of the last twilight, not really twilight, the last splendid years of Istanbul as an Ottoman capital, seen through the eyes of a Venetian painter. Here you see the number of people of different costumes on this bridge. And here he's painting an Ottoman victory over Greece in 1897. He's an official court painter, the last great court painter in my opinion. So he has to paint victories, showing the power of the empire. And this was put in the ambassador's waiting room in Dolmabahce Palace as a not very subtle message. Oh, actually, there's still a lot of life in the empire. And this 1898, this is the arrival of the German Kaiser in Dolmabahce Palace on the Bosphorus. As the honored guest of the Sultan, the last great Ottoman alliance, it's not Venice or France, it's Germany, which was fatal for the Ottoman Empire really, because it encouraged it to enter into the First World War, which destroyed it. But you see on the right the palace, on the left the Bosphorus, behind them the mosque of Dolmabahce, and on top of the hill above is the new German embassy, a symbol of the new great military and commercial power, the power that's going to build the Berlin to Baghdad railway. And there, it's by Zonaro, you see the German Empress as the Sultan's guests in Yildiz Palace. And that's a scene in the grounds of the British Embassy. He paints diplomatic life. That's an Ottoman prince, Burhaneddin, in Yildiz. He paints portraits. There's no Islamic prohibition. He paints portraits for the Sultan. That is Zonaro himself, as an honored Turkish official. He learns Turkish. There are rumors that he was very sympathetic to Islam. Now you see him. He had permission to go anywhere in Istanbul with Ottoman protection, painting. He also paints the life of the city and street life, things that grand Ottoman painters did not paint. So, here you see a scene on the Bosphorus, ladies whose faces are not covered. That's in front of Dolmabahce Mosque. That must be local Christian ladies. Here you see Ottoman Turkish ladies about to get on a kayuk, but they're actually touching the kayuk's arm. And here you see a Shia procession in Istanbul of Muharram, where there's the ritual flagellation in honor of the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandsons. Now this is a Shia ceremony in Sunni Istanbul. This would not be allowed today, but it was allowed under the Ottoman Empire. And here you see a ceremony of the Rifai dervishes walking over people. Zonaro was fascinated by Sufi orders. His own face is said to be one of the faces on the left, and this is one of the only pictorial representations in those days of a Sufi ceremony, and I've seen it reproduced in a Sufi lodge in Istanbul several years ago. So it's again a picture by a Venetian. It's used as a source by local people themselves. And here you see a Ramadan celebration. This is not recorded, such popular scenes are not recorded by the great Osman Hamdi, the Turkish artist of the same period, who is extremely jealous of Zonaro and never mentions Zonaro in his writings. They were rivals for Abdul Hamid's favor. A fishing scene. And here is Izzet Pasha, one of the officials of the court. Zonaro would go 2 or 3 times a week to Yildiz Palace. He never really met the Sultan, but he did meet the officials. Izzet Pasha is the man who persuaded Abdul Hamid to build a railway from Damascus to the Hejaz to Medina. He's a representative of Arab influence. And here you see a photograph by Zonaro's wife of Abdulhamid going to the mosque in 1908 after the Young Turk Revolution. It's easier then to take photographs. And there is Abdulhamid himself, 1908. He's briefly a constitutional monarch of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is changing, and Zonaro is finally allowed, only 1 or 2 sessions, to paint the Sultan himself. He probably painted 2,400 pictures, of which over half are of Istanbul. So it's a really unique record, and I hope that there has been a Zonaro exhibition in Florence, thanks to Errol Maxome, and hopefully there will be one in Venice, and hopefully one in London one day. And Zonaro, being at the heart of the life of the city, he also knew not only the Sultan and the court, but the other side, the revolutionaries. And here you see a picture painted in April 1909 by Zonaro of Enver Pasha, the hero of the Young Turks, who overthrows the Sultan. And this picture is now in Istanbul. He's the man who really ruled the Ottoman Empire until 1918 and dragged it into the First World War. He was an army officer, and he was very pro-German, and you all know the results. So I would like to end on this extraordinary Venetian record of Ottoman life, really beginning in the 16th century or earlier. And imagine Zonaro also painted a copy of Bellini's portrait of Fatih for Abdulhamid. So we've come full circle back to this extraordinary portrait. So there is a copy of Bellini's portrait by a later court painter from Venice. And hopefully we will have other conferences and exhibitions in Venice, and hopefully also we will all meet again in Istanbul and maybe next year in Beirut. Thank you very much.
So we've now got time for questions to Philip. Anything? Does anyone want to lead with something?
A question about the painting the Bellini's painting doesn't have those writings at the side of where
Which painting?
you see these writings. Just curious, because I think there is a painting about Bellini.
It's 1480, and then a month, November 1480. And on the left, the great Sultan Mohammed II, the Emperor, 1480. So he's copying Bellini's inscription, or the inscription put on Bellini's portrait for Abdulhamid.
Because memory of Bellini's portrait having something like the great Sultan Caesar.
Yes, it says great Sultan there.
Yeah, something like that.
So it's a Venetian praising the Ottoman Sultan, and we've just been fighting Venice.
Yeah.
Right, Jim.
I've always been curious about how it was that this Mehmed II wanted a portrait of himself when it was so against all Islamic norms, really.
It's against norms but not laws, and I think Mehmed II was exceptionally open-minded. It's known that he knew Greek and was interested in the history of Troy, so why wouldn't he want a painting? But probably these paintings were kept inside the palace for himself, a very favoured guest, and not known about outside. But later sultans also commissioned, and grand viziers would commission portraits in the 16th century. It was a series. The whole history of Ottoman paintings is being rewritten. There were also a tradition of market drawings, including of people, and then in the 18th century there were panoramas of cities done by local artists. And Selim III, reigning from 1789, he has a portrait, a wonderful portrait by a Greek called Constantini of himself, and commissions prints of Ottoman sultans done in London. So this interest in portraits, because Istanbul was a centre of artists as well as of everything else. They weren't always the best artists, but there were lots of artists working for ambassadors. So the sultans knew about it, and they would want to be left out, I think. There's this Ottoman eclecticism about borrowing elements that suited the personal tastes.
But even though it seems to go against Islamic tradition?
It's an Islamic tradition, but not all Islamic traditions, because there are Persian miniatures and Mogul miniatures with wonderful portraits of Muslim emperors of India.
You mentioned the fact that the Church of the Salute may be influenced by Islamic architecture. As far as I know, it was a Redentory, the largest church, who may be influenced by Islamic architecture, because one of his clients was a Bartolomeo brother, whose other brother was by Constantinople in the 16th century.
I think I may have meant the Redentory.
Sorry?
Thank you very much. I think I may have meant the Redentory, not the...
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Is it proven?
Yeah, because the two steeples at the sides are looking like minarets.
Yes. That's right. I meant that. Is it now generally accepted, this idea that it's influenced by Istanbul mosques?
Well, it's allegedly maybe influenced. You might have seen paintings or watercolor or something that maybe the two Barber brothers might have exchanged. But there is no, well, as far as I know, there is no evidence that he did or he didn't.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One of the most striking things about descriptions of coronations of doges and also in paintings of Venetian rituals is the presence and importance of Ottoman ambassadors, and there's a sort of sense that they provide legitimacy to both coronations and these processions. And I just wondered if you have any comments on that, and also, given your deep and wide knowledge of many other courts, can you think of any other places where that's also the case?
Sorry, my hearing is terrible. What was the end of your question?
Would you have any? Do you know of any other examples where the importance of ambassadors in legitimacy, in the legitimization of?
No, I think it's a very important point. I think Istanbul was so important and fascinating. That's why the embassies were so important in Istanbul. The power and the strangeness, it's not really so much strangeness as the specificity of the Ottoman Empire. And I think there must have been a tradition in Western Europe of not painting the ambassador they received in the throne room or in the Galerie des Glaces, because in Versailles there's a wonderful drawing of Louis XV receiving the Ottoman ambassadors, but I don't know of other drawings of him receiving other ambassadors. So I think it's so reception by a full-scale reception by a monarch is so secret and so important that you couldn't paint it, except when it's an Ottoman ambassador, when it has to be recorded because it's exceptional, because not many came. And there's also a print of George III receiving the first Ottoman ambassador in England. But I don't know of prints of George III receiving other ambassadors. So the Ottoman relationship has to be commemorated pictorially. But the whole history of diplomatic paintings and ceremonial has yet to be written, because you have to be an art historian and a historian of ceremonies and read the dispatches in the original documents to begin to understand it. There's often references very casually in the dispatches of French ambassadors. Oh, I brought a painter with me to record the scene, 1724 in Istanbul, but they don't mention the painter's name.
Any other questions or comments? If I can ask something, I'm intrigued by, is it Aloysius?
Yes.
So was he pilot, and then he was also a later advisor led the campaign against Hungary.
And he's illegitimate, so he can't make it in Venice, so he has to try the Ottoman system. So he's playing for both sides. He's the Austrian, and then I think he's captured by the Hungarians and then executed. I think.
He was on his way back to Istanbul, and he was executed by the Swedes. On the order of the Sultan, it was a failed campaign.
We can't hear you, so we can't hear you.
Oh, pardon. Yes, in fact, he was as Philip Mansel said, he was the illegitimate son of the Bible, who then became Doge. In fact, his father became Doge. But since Alvise was an illegitimate son, he couldn't go to Venice and make a career there. So he made a career in the Ottoman Empire. And he joined the campaign on Hungary, but since it wasn't a victory, on his way back he was executed on the order of the Sultan.
And what you notice is the same name is recurring in Ottoman-Venetian relations, like Quentin. And I wonder, were there great Ottoman or Islamic collections in Venice? Did these families not want to show to their neighbours that they'd been there? As other ambassadors in other countries did make Ottoman collections.
But there's this is the question. Okay. So there's Francesco Morosini came back from Vera with an amazing collection of shields, Ottoman shields, and they are all in the museum there right now. So there are other important artifacts, like for example a flag, an Ottoman flag with all the Quranic inscriptions. But apart from that, I think Venetians were Venetian families, aristocratic families, were very fond of Ottoman material culture, but it was like normal furniture in their houses. Carpets, you mentioned, chairs also with pearl, for example. Like Near Eastern artifacts and manufactures were generally part of the Venetian material culture. It was a sort of community of consumption, we can say, the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian Republic. He also mentioned, for example, textiles. And sometimes it's true, sometimes you can't really say whether it was Venetian or Ottoman, because they had a sort of community of taste and community of consumption.
Probably something like the first carpet party in one of the evenings, paintings, right? With the Pope. It was the first time a carpet was put for the reception as a very there's something like that in kind of an oriented kind of put out for the reception of the Pope or ambassador. I can't remember, but it's one of the Bellini paintings that I've seen that the first time. I'm quite bizarre like that, when I became one of the courtly demonstration.
Yes, well, yeah, Bellini, the two Bellinis, in fact, they were the most important interpreters of this period of the 15th century, Carpaccio and Bellini. And so they are unbelievable sources of information concerning the relationship with Venice and the Ottoman Empire. And since the representation of the Ottoman Empire was the symbol, was used as symbol for other biblical representations, it's extremely interesting. I don't remember this precise painting you're mentioning, but coming back perhaps to the question Jill asked, you know that when Bellini was invited to Istanbul, apart from painting this famous painting that was saved because Mehmed II's son, being so attached to the Islamic tradition, he destroyed parts of the paintings that were made by Bellini, but Bellini even painted some nudes, in the court. So he painted some nude scenes inside the court. Then, unfortunately, those were destroyed by Mehmed II's son, who had to please the ulema. So he chose another cultural perspective in his domination.
If you go to the Accademia, and there's a picture by Giovanni Bellini, I think, of the martyrdom of St. Mark, it is full of turban Turks.
Just as a detail, how do we know that he painted nudes? That's very early for nude painting in Europe. How do we know it? How it survived?
So there's a book that has just been published on this issue. The author is Antonio Soldi, S-O-L-D-I, and he consulted sources in Venice and also lives of painters, of important painters that were written afterwards based on first-hand documents.
You touched on the question of slavery, and because it's rather a topical subject on the transatlantic area, to what extent were slaves employed, and presumably the Venetian galleries were largely driven by slaves? What about the building and the life within Venice? Were slaves present there?
I think Vera should answer that.
It was domestic slavery. It was not labor force as like the plantations. It was domestic slavery. Was that the question?
In Venice, but in the wider Mediterranean, I've just been writing about Louis XIV. One of the duties of French consuls in the Ottoman Empire in the 1670s, you had to supply, say, 50 slaves a year for the king's navy. So there's a whole market in the Mediterranean of slaves being bought and sold like any other commodity. And there's a famous slave arsenal in Istanbul, and there were Christian orders founded specifically to buy back slaves, the mercenarians and redemptorists and others. And then there's a whole slave market of Russians and Ukrainians being bought for the Ottoman Empire, and the whole other slave trade going up from East Africa to Persia and Arabia, as you well know. And I think there will be more books written about this now. It's not just the North Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah, I was wondering about to what extent, and because you mentioned Eric Derstler's research on diplomatic relations between Venetian and the Ottoman Empire, to what extent is that shaping the history of diplomacy in the early modern period? And can we say, is it worthwhile pursuing that line of inquiry that relations with the Ottoman Empire might have influenced Venetian diplomacy, European diplomacy by extension, more than we previously thought? Because previously we obviously focused on relations between Florence and Venice, Milan and Florence, Venice. Is that worthwhile pursuing?
My hearing is so...
To what extent did diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire change Venetian diplomatic practices?
Yes, when people say that, I'm not quite certain, because there's also a lot of diplomacy in the Italian peninsula and in the French court and the Habsburg court at the same time as in the Ottoman Empire. And I think the ceremonial and the fact of being in a Muslim country makes it very different. I mean, not completely different, but relying more on interpreters. So it's only the interpreter is really mainly in Istanbul. So I don't think it changes other countries' diplomacy so much. But whether laws of immunity are developing in the 16th century, not always practiced. And then the Ottoman government has this tradition of paying for the upkeep of foreign embassies. I think that's specific to Istanbul.
Last question, Flora.
Posso farle in italiano, magari mi traduco? Il fatto che l'impero ottomano nel declino, in qualche maniera, quindi sul piano, si avvalesse di un editore italiano, un musicista italiano, per esempio, maestri orologiai europei, pakistani, poeti, insomma, tutto quello che poteva prendere sul piano dall'Europa, quasi sembrava un mottino di guerra, in un certo senso, ma perché l'impero ottomano non poteva offrire tutto questo artigianato, eccetera, quindi è sintomo di declino, oppure perché l'impero ottomano si è sempre avvalso di tutte queste cose troppo grazie ai commerci che c'erano.
So, I will translate the question. The lady asks whether the attitude the late Ottomans had towards Western artistic expressions were a symptom of internal decline. Were they not able to find within the empire such expertise, or was it something that had always been in place as a structural feature of the Ottoman system due to trade shifts?
I don't think it's a sign of decline. It's a tradition of eclecticism, looking to different countries and different craftsmen from different countries. And they were training Ottoman artists in the late 19th century in military schools, engineering schools, and you can see these officers of painting in some of the pictures are in the modern Ottoman palaces like Dolmabahce and Yildiz. So it's all changing, and then they have their own court, their own grand painter, Osman Hamdi Bey, who does rather dignified pictures of somebody in a mosque or a student or animals or birds. So it's all happening and changing. And the Ottoman Empire is falling in love with the Ottoman elite with Parisian or Italian culture in 1880, as it had previously been in love with Persian culture or other cultures. It's just part of the tradition. And then there are many very capable artists living in Istanbul around 1900, like Zonaro.
But also in the time of the creation of the portrait is maybe, and the portrait comes to life with the Queen of Cyprus, and then starts getting the race, and I believe it was Constantini. Is there something in the history of portrait?
Yeah.
And
Well, yes, there is an attitude of prosopography in Renaissance painting. Bear in mind also that Mehmed II, Philip Mansel mentioned the War of Troy, but he was also very fond of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great stands as the example of royalty in the Middle East and in Western Europe, everywhere, and it's a sort of common Aristotelian background that is the same for all the princes. And Mehmed II, since he was willing to be the prince, because he felt he was the successor of the Roman Empire, he even invented a Greek genealogy, saying he was from the Trebizonda last Byzantine emperors. Maybe there is a connection with portrait of a prince. Maybe.